Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. I'm Megan from NCBFAA, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for today's presentation. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that, as always, all attendees are in listen-only mode. However, you can submit written questions or comments at any time, which we will answer at the end as time permits. We will be sending out a PDF copy of the presentation as well, and we hope that you enjoy this, this FSVP programming. We're really excited to see you. I'm excited to welcome a panel of expert speakers for our presentation today, and I'll be introducing the moderator. Mike Lahar of A.N. Deringer is our Regulated Agencies Committee co-chair, the committee that is handling all things FDA, including today's topic, FSVP, and he will be moderating today's discussion and introducing the full panel. We're excited to have this panel with us today, and so without further delay, Mike, I would love to turn this over to you.
Thank you, Megan. And as Megan said, I co-chair the Regulatory Agencies Committee along with Roger Clark, and we've been very active over the last couple of years with the implementation of the ACE ITDS requirements. So I'm very happy to have three very knowledgeable guests along with us today. We have Domenic Veneziano, Stuart Schmidt of UPS, and Kristen Spotz of the Grocery Manufacturers Association. So up first we have Domenic. As many of you remember, Domenic is formerly of the Food and Drug Administration. He had a 24-year career with them and has served as a senior FDA leader with prominent roles in the oversight of FDA's National Import Operations Program, including the development and implementation of FDA's targeting system, PREDICT, and the Import Trade Communication System, otherwise known as ITACS, the integration of Customs and Border Protection's ACE system with FDA system and the new Food Safety Modernization Act and Food and Drug Safety Innovations Act. As a consultant, Domenic works closely with his clients to provide advice to producers, importers, exporters, and distributors of FDA-regulated commodities. He helps clients import products into the U.S. and get them removed from import alert, as well as evaluating medical devices and food facilities to determine compliance with food manufacturing practice regulations. So without any further ado, Domenic, I welcome you and invite you to educate our membership.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you everyone for joining. Thanks. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the FSVP program. I'm going to go in a little order. I'm going to talk a little bit about the compliance aspect. The whole presentation is going to be geared towards kind of the brokers and how it's going to impact all of you in terms of compliance and how things are going to be moving forward. So we're going to talk about FSMA and FSVP compliance. We're going to talk a little bit about how it impacts the custom house brokers. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the exemptions and modified requirements that the importers are going to have to comply with. First of all, taking a look at what is FSVP. A lot of presentations are given, but they never talk about what the program actually is and what it's intended to do. So it is a program that importers must have in place to verify that their foreign suppliers are producing food in a manner that provides the same level of public health protection as the preventive controls or produce safety regulations as appropriate, and to ensure that the supplier's food is not adulterated and is not misbranded with respect to allergen and labeling. This is very important in terms of the impact, and I'll talk a little bit about why on the next slide. So looking at what it is, the Prohibited Act. It is actually a prohibited act under 301 that the importation of food with an inadequate or a FSVP plan not in place is a violation of 301, which means it's penalized by imprisonment for no more than 1 year. It also can be set a fine of $1,000 or less. Obviously, there's other provisions if someone is committed of a criminal act. Prior to that, it gets elevated. But the more important one is 801A, where if it appears from examination of such samples or otherwise that the importer is in violation of Section 805, which is the FSVP requirement, then the article shall be refused. And I think it's important to understand from the broker's point of view that technically the product itself, the article, is not violated. And therefore, I believe that moving forward, the importer of record and as a delegate of the importer of record, the broker needs to be prepared to provide evidence to overcome that violation. And how would you do that? Obviously, the way to do that would be to try to find another FSVP importer that could bring that product in, because you don't want that product to be refused or exported out of the country. So looking at the compliance aspects of what can happen with failure, obviously suspension of food facility registration under 102B is a major impact. Once you get suspended, you can't bring products in at all. It would get refused both at the prior notice level as well as the admissibility level, and without a registration number at the time, you won't be able to get it through customs. Withdrawal of commercial contracts, major retail. So if an FSVP importer gets placed on that, most people are going to pull out possibly and go to somebody else because their products will not be allowed into the country from that importer. Disruption of consumer confidence, obviously, placement on FDA import alert. And as I just mentioned, this placement on import alert is for the FSVP importer. It is technically not for the product itself because the product is not violated. What the agency is thinking is that they're going to put the importer on the alert along with that product, but not technically the product, because the product is still not adulterated or misbranded under the law. Obviously, product recall and mandatory recall now under Section 206, extremely important. And the big thing that this is going to do is this is going to lead to FDA oversight in other areas. So if there's a violation to the importer, it impacts a lot of things. One of the things that it's going to impact is other inspections. So if that importer or that product is subject to the VQIP requirements, the Voluntary Qualified Importer Program, that would be suspended, and they would no longer have that expedited process of coming into the country until they get in compliance. So that is one of the aspects, and one of the qualifications of VQIP is being FSVP compliant. So just to be a heads up with that. And then the last is two other compliance aspects. Obviously, administrative detention on the domestic side. As you all know, FDA has the authority to detain products on the import side. But under Section 207, there's the administrative detention that they can hold products up domestically before being imported, before being distributed into commerce. And then they can invoke Section 414 under the FSMA. Section 414 expands the requirements that they've already had. They had the ability to ask for records on products that were violated, but they never had the capability of extending that to other products that may have also been involved due to the violation. So Section 414 gives them the ability to do that. I want to talk a little bit about the inspection strategy, and again, looking towards how it's going to impact the brokers down the road. The agency is going to plan on doing initial importer inspections over the course of FY17. And they haven't really started yet. They're still in the process of training everybody and developing that training program. It is expected that training will start in June for the field so that they can have the regulatory training that they need. They're going to do initial importers. That means importers that are identified as the FSVP importer, but they don't do manufacturing and they don't do processing. That aspect is going to be handled under preventive controls. So that's going to be handled a little bit separate. For FSVP, that's what they're going to target, is those initial importers. That means that they're going to do for-cause inspections. And as I mentioned before, one of the criteria of being in the Voluntary Qualified Importer Program is a couple of things, and we'll talk a little bit about them, I believe, on the next slide. But they're going to do for-cause inspections. They're going to look at importers that are on import alert, and they're going to look at the violation issues. So that's a big thing. The other thing they're going to do is they're going to do VQIP inspections. So anybody who applies for VQIP, those are the FSVP importers that they're going to target as a result of that. I would guarantee, though, that as a result of VQIP, the brokers are going to be impacted. So VQIP comes into effect in January of 2018. That's when the first application happens, between January and May. And one of the criteria of that is that you can't have violation, when your broker can't be in violation of the FDA audit program. So if under FSVP, if they're going to do VQIP inspections, they're going to end up doing broker audits to verify that people are doing things and handling things correctly. So looking at the criteria, obviously you can see some of them, and I know that most of you know all of these, but the quality assurance program, assurance of compliance with supplier verification or other applicable regulations, current facility certification, 3-year history of importing goods into the United States, and no ongoing FDA administrative or judicial action, including filer and brokers. So it is extremely important moving forward that you communicate with the importer of record to make sure that you get the right information to put in and to file, or that you have an agreement with them to say that you're not responsible for any information that's coming in there. So when FDA goes in, they understand that all the information that was given was due to the importer of record, and so that the blame or the responsibility will be placed on the importer of record working with the supply chain to ensure that they understand who that FSVP importer is at the time of entry. So the data elements that you're going to need for importer identification, you have to provide the FSVP importer, which is, so the entity code is going to be FSV, and it's going to provide, you have to provide firm name, firm address, DUNS number, an email address, and an individual's name and telephone number if you choose to. That part is going to be optional. The product is a food and the above data elements are not submitted. Obviously, as you know, it's going to be rejected by CBP. The big question was DUNS numbers. The concern was, are people going to have a DUNS number, and are they, if they don't have it, are they going to back up trade? As a result of that, the agency is going to go to a soft roller, and I believe the announcement just came out earlier this week to say that, you know, for the time being, they're going to move that way. It is extremely important that you get this information from your importer of record or from your clients, so that this information can be correct. And as I mentioned before, it is extremely important that you have it in an agreement that you can show FDA to say all the information in terms of how that supply chain works and who's receiving it and who's considered to be the FSVP importer at the time of entry is based upon information I received from somebody. And that hopefully somebody would be your client, obviously. So some exemptions. I think you read these all, but you need to know them because there is an exemption code for when you're putting them into the system. For firms subject to juice and seafood hazard regulations, research and evaluation, personal consumption, meaning that it's not going to be sold, it's going to be consumed by the individual, alcoholic beverages, food transshipped through U.S., imported for process and export, U.S. goods returned, which is an interesting one, I believe, in terms of not being part of FSVP. So technically, if it's manufactured in the U.S., it leaves the United States, and it doesn't get further processed. It comes back into the United States, whether it's going back to the manufacturer or going into all consumption. It's exempt from FSVP because it's being handled supposedly from the manufacturer in the U.S. under preventive controls. And then meat and poultry. So looking at some of the modified requirements, it gets a little bit complicated in terms of requirements. You have to read the rule very, very carefully to determine it, what's exempt and what's not exempt. In my eyes, if you look at all of those exemptions, I believe nothing is really exempt from FSVP. I believe that even if you're a manufacturer of seafood, you need to document the fact that you made that determination that you have no products within your company that are going to be subject to FSVP and document that. And either way, you're going to have to contain records, because if the agency goes in there, you have to demonstrate that you made a conscious effort not to comply with FSVP and the reasons why you made that. So, in all cases, it's best to document the decisions that are being made at the time that you make them. Low-acid canned foods, manufacturing processors, dietary supplements, very small importers, and small foreign suppliers, and countries with comparable equivalent food safety. Those are the ones I picked out in terms of modified requirements, and we're going to go through each of them to see what is required under that aspect. Most of them are the same, but we'll touch on them and go through each one. Looking at the low-acid canned foods, first of all, they can't be further processed. So if they're further processed in any way when they come in, then they're not exempt, or they still have to comply with all the provisions of FSVP. You do not need an FSVP with respect to microbiological hazards for that food. However, you will need them for chemical and radiological as well as physical. So that aspect would still be in place. You must verify and document that the food was produced in accordance with Part 113 of the low-acid canned food regulations. So you still have to verify and document that aspect. That could mean having a third party go in, take a look, and make sure that they're in compliance and document that, and still have a qualified individual to take a look at that. And then again, with respect to all other matters that are not controlled by 113, such as chemical and radiological and physical, you must have an FSVP in place. Manufacturer and processors, if in compliance with preventive controls, you are deemed in compliance with most aspects of FSVP. That's the supply chain. That's the supply chain portion of the preventive control regulations. And again, the requirement for identifying the importer identification at entry, that is consistent throughout each. At each stage, you need to identify that importer based on the information and the data elements that I talked about earlier. Dietary supplements, you must utilize a qualified individual and qualified auditor as part of the requirements to ensure that somebody is meeting the CGMPs for dietary supplements. You must, again, identify the FSVP importer at the time of entry. Importers whose customers are subject to dietary supplements. You must utilize a qualified individual and qualified auditor, again, to verify that people are in compliance with 111 of the dietary supplement provisions. However, you must identify the FSVP importer at entry, and you're required to have an annual written assurance that your customer is in compliance with those CGMPs. And again, you must maintain records associated with all of the information. So for very small importers and small foreign suppliers, you must document that you meet the definition of a very small importer and with respect to human foods and or human animal foods before initially importing food as a very small importer and thereafter on an annual basis by December 31st of each calendar year. And the important word there obviously is before initially importing into the United States. You must also obtain written assurance that your small foreign supplier complies with preventive controls, again, before first approving that supplier for an applicable calendar year. You must utilize a qualified individual and qualified auditor. You must identify the foreign supplier verification program importer at entry, and you're required to have an annual written assurance as well. Just briefly, the definition of a very small importer is difficult. Obviously, there's a lot of definitions out there, and it gets a little bit complicated. But I'm going to go over what a very small importer means. And with respect to importation of human food, an importer, including any subsidiaries or affiliates, that averages less than $1 million per year, adjusted for inflation, during the 3-year period preceding the applicable calendar year in sales of human food, combined with the U.S. market value of human food imported, manufactured, processed, packed, or held without sale. And with respect to the importation of animal food, an importer averaging less than $2.5 million per year, adjusted for inflation. So it gets a little bit complicated, and I think it's best that you go through and look at the register and the definition associated with those to make sure that it's perfectly clear what is defined as a very small importer or defined as a small foreign supplier under the preventive control and the produce safety rules themselves. Finally, countries with comparable or equivalent food safety systems. Generally, FSVP requirements do not apply when importing certain foods from suppliers in countries whose food safety systems FDA has officially recognized. It does not mean that all foods from those countries, and there's only 2 of them right now, New Zealand and Canada, doesn't mean all foods from those countries are eligible just to come in and be exempt from FSVP. Those lists is on FDA's website. New Zealand, it's all of them, but for Canada, it's specific to different types of commodities, different types of foods. It applies to food that would not be processed further. So if it's coming in for further processing, it is not exempt. It's going to have to go through the preventive controls in terms of within the United States, because it's going to be handled that way. Importer must document that the foreign supplier is under oversight of comparable or equivalent food safety systems. Again, documentation is extremely important. Food is within the scope of the official recognition or determination, and the supplier is in good compliance standards with comparable or equivalent food safety authorities. And that covers kind of what I wanted to go over. I'll turn it back over to Mike. And I'm happy to answer questions after we're through. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Domenic. Has Stuart joined us? Okay. Well, if we can then, actually, Stuart, Domenic, I had a couple of questions. Maybe I'll pitch out to you right here, just to kind of keep keep continuing with your presentation. I was curious about your feelings of a third party doing a review for an FSVP importer. I know under the regulations it is acceptable for the FSVP importer to go out and contract with somebody to act as a qualifying individual. But when it comes right down to what we provide to FDA for information, how would that be handled? Does there still need to be a qualified individual at that company, or would they use the party that they contracted with? How do we report that for FDA purposes?
I think you have to report it out officially. What's going to end up happening is that FDA would go to the FSVP importer that's identified within the entry. They would go there, and it would be on that company to make sure that they have the appropriate people. So the sign-off on the FSVP plan itself has to have sign-off from a qualified individual anyway. So that is part of it. And then if the company wants to bring in the qualified individual to actually answer any questions, they can do that. But the responsibility is the ultimate responsibility is the FSVP importer to bring all the paperwork together for an FDA investigator, or to bring the appropriate people at the table.
Now, I know when you're reporting the FSVP importer information, they're not necessarily requiring a name of a person at the company, but they are requiring an email address. I've had a number of people ask me, does that email address have to be for a particular person, or could it be for a generic email box, or has FDA made any indication as to their preference at this point?
They actually haven't made. I haven't seen anything in terms of, and I know that the guidance document that was being developed doesn't specify an individual. It just has to be obviously someone within that company that has the capability of answering or responding back to the agency if needed. There's 2 ways inspections are going to be conducted in the future. One of them is going to be on site. The other one is going to be an electronic form. So that email, whoever that is provided, whatever email is provided, it should be significant enough to where if FDA asks for documentation to conduct an inspection, that they have the capability of doing that.
Now, Customs issued a CSMS earlier this week about DUNS numbers. And in the CSMS, they indicated that FDA would accept UNK when the DUNS number is unknown for the FSV importer. I think there has been some confusion about that. Can you clarify what that means exactly? Is that just we don't transmit a DUNS number, or does that mean we don't have to transmit the FSVP importer information at all?
No, you have to provide the information. The only thing with the DUNS number is that the agency and individuals were concerned with the fact that that DUNS number might not be known at the time, or people haven't really gotten one. And the concern was holding up trade. And if that number wasn't in there, or if there wasn't a field, that information would get rejected at the ACE process by CBP. It would never get to FDA. So they had to do something. If you think about when I was with the agency, we had it conditional. We had all the information related to FSVP importer to be conditional because of the fact of the compliance dates go all the way out to 2020. So we didn't want to hold up trade and make it a mandatory thing. The decision was made to make it actually mandatory. So if you were going to make it mandatory, that means that CBP would reject any field that didn't contain any data. And the concern was people weren't going to have a DUNS number. So my understanding is that that DUNS number, you can utilize the UNK and then all the other information so that it gets to FDA. If that DUNS number shows up as a UNK, my understanding is the agency is going to call you and ask you why you don't have one. So I think that's going to be a little hard to do. I think the resources will be tough, but overall, I think that's the plan moving forward so they don't hold up trade.
Great, great. Megan, are we all set to go with Stuart or Kristen at this point?
Yeah, so we've been assigning you some questions as they've come up. Mike, are you getting those through the in-webinar messaging system?
To be honest with you, I've been listening to Domenic so intently I didn't notice you were assigning them to me.
That is an excellent answer. So yes, the answer is Kristen is ready to go, and we can go ahead with her presentation, or her comments, I should say. Or if you'd like to peruse those questions and see while we're on Domenic's portion, if there's any other discussion we want to have, and then we'll jump into Kristen's presentation.
Well, how about we go ahead with Kristen, and then while she's presenting, I can try and duck and cover.
Hey, Mike.
So,
this is Stuart.
Oh, hey, Stuart.
Yeah, so I'm working into the online right now. So if Kristen goes ahead, then I should be ready to go right after that.
Great, great. Thanks, Stuart. So we've got Kristen Spotz that is joining us from the GMA, or the Grocery Manufacturers Association. Kristen is the Senior Manager in Food Safety and Quality Assurance, where her main responsibilities include reviewing member-submitted HACCP plans for compliance, which is very apropos for what we're working with. Analyzing regulatory developments and emerging food safety issues, and conducting facility visits to troubleshoot sanitation and food safety issues. Kristen has a strong manufacturing background, both as a consultant and as a company team member, with a broad range of industry experience within the U.S. Food and Drug Association regulated facilities, such as beverage processing, snack foods, and medical device manufacturing. Kristen received her BS in chemistry from the University of Central Florida, and without any further ado, I'm pleased to welcome Kristen, and Kristen is going to have some insight from manufacturing on their readiness for the FSVP legislation.
Yes. Thank you, Mike, and thank you for inviting me to this webinar. As Mike mentioned, I'm from the Grocery Manufacturers Association, and that's one of the largest trade associations associations in Washington, D.C., representing the consumer product goods industry. So in preparation for this webinar, I don't have a presentation, but I just wanted to talk with regard to we represent the food and beverage industry, and I went ahead and interviewed ahead of time and got some time with my members who are large manufacturers and asked them a few questions about their level of FSVP readiness, their interaction with the brokerage community, and if there's anything that they would like to convey to you. So with that, I'll go ahead, and I cannot reveal their names, the company names, but I can tell you these are large companies that you would recognize. So I asked the question of their perspective on industry and the general state of readiness for FSMA compliance. One large member said the general state of readiness for medium to relatively large companies in terms of FSVP readiness is relatively good. You know, of course, there are some gaps that do exist, but they feel relatively prepared. For smaller suppliers in the supply chain, this particular member is stating that they are concerned that the smaller members could have a considerable amount of confusion, but of course they will have a longer compliance date. So what more outreach needs to be done to that community. Another large manufacturer, I asked about their belief on the state of readiness for FSMA compliance for both their FSVP compliance for both their company and the supply chain. From their perspective, they have been working for several months with their internal functional teams, brokers, suppliers, and customers to get ready for FSVP, and they feel they're fairly ready for the May 30th go live date. They say some of the bigger challenges have been understanding the application, all the different modified requirements for FSVP. They do also feel that the smaller companies that don't have large in-house resources, such as legal counsel, because this is a fairly complex rule, companies that don't have broad quality and customs compliance teams could have a relatively difficult time with the go-live date. Another question I asked is, how are you interacting with your customs brokers and filers regarding the change to the entry process? How's that level of communication going? And are we ready for the May 30th date? And do you think those conversations as to who the FSVP importer are readily occurring throughout the supply chain? Talking to one very large member, they indicated they've had several meetings, in fact last week, with their brokers to ensure that imports are addressed. With regard to across the supply chain though, outside of their company, they do have some concerns that the supply chains might not have hashed out who the FSVP importer is, and they're a little bit concerned because there's a significant amount of liability when someone is listed as the FSVP importer. While this one company is talking extensively to their brokers, they said not everyone across industry is talking directly to the brokers. Therefore, we think there is going to be some steep learning. Another question I asked the company is, as I said, have you received outreach from brokers regarding FSVP and who they should enter as the FSVP importer beginning May 30th? This large manufacturer stated yes, they've been working in collaboration with their brokers, counsel, FDA to identify who would be identified as the FSVP importer. And I said, is there anything the customs community should know? And they said that this is they want to communicate that this is a relatively complex rule, and that more outreach like these webinars are probably needed to get the word out. When I asked that same question to another large manufacturer, they said brokers should be keenly aware of the FSVP importer issue as to, who will be identified come May 30th. And they once again said continued active outreach in the supply chain is encouraged. over-communicate versus under-communicate. So the tagline is, if you haven't heard from your customers as to who the FSVP importer is come May 30th, to make certain that you're reaching out. So with that, and I wanted to add some further feedback. There is a standardized curriculum for foreign supplier verification that was recently released the end of January with the first pilot. The first class after that was sold out with, like, I believe, an attendance of 30. And since then, there hasn't been a large demand for the course. And so that we don't know why. And there is some concern that there is a lot of misconceptions amongst the supply chain as to the requirements of FSVP. We are offering at GMA an FSVP course on May 23rd, and this is the standardized curriculum, on May 23rd and May 24th. You can go to www.gmaonline.org to register. And I wanted to bring out a couple other points. Fundamentally, we've seen one misconception also with FSVP. It's not, compliance is not assessed at the border. It's not a border program. So they're not going to be asking for FSVP documents at the border as part of the entry process. Compliance is rather assessed at a later date, as Domenic indicated, either through remote records access or them visiting the actual FSVP importer's office. FDA will be building from what I've been told, FDA will be building a database of FSVP importers based on the information you enter into ACE, and then those are the people that they will go and inspect. Domenic did mention VQIP. The only thing I'm going to mention about VQIP, we did comment as a trade association on VQIP during the rulemaking process. Right now, we don't anticipate a large number of our members participating in VQIP, but yet we know it's still early. So I just wanted to add that in. And with that, I will go ahead and transfer it over back to Mike.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kristen. I'm just curious. I'd be interested to see why you feel that importers are not interested in the VQIP program, because it does have some very interesting benefits for companies that are interested in getting expedited clearance, particularly companies that may be dealing in items like fresh commodities that could spoil quickly.
Yes, that's a good point. What we were seeing is the amount of time to assemble the quality assurance program and put together the documentation. Some of the members, when they did the numbers they did for their product lines, they did not, and we don't represent the produce community, but they did not see that the cost outweighed the benefits. And this is just our members providing that feedback.
Sure.
The other is that, you know, supply chains, as we all know, are fluid, and that right now the way VQIP is designed, you can't change what products are in your VQIP application throughout the year. You have to wait till that next year. So if you all of a sudden have an outage or you lose a supplier due to a fire, I once had that with vitamin C, and I need to rapidly get vitamin C in this country, and I want to put that as part of my VQIP application in the middle of the year. I don't have that flexibility, and they really wanted that flexibility. So we just received that feedback. I could maybe see, like you said, maybe more in the produce realm, or maybe if you're trying to get a product quick to market, in terms of your racing to get a product to market, but for our members in general just did not see that the benefits outweighed the cost.
Interesting, very interesting. Okay, well, Stuart, I think we've probably got your slides all ready to go. Megan, have we got that queued up? So, Stuart, for many of you, you know Stuart very well. Stuart has been a very active member of the NCBFAA. He is the Corporate Compliance Manager for UPS Supply Chain, and in this role, he is responsible for operations compliance, customer consulting, and is a government agency liaison. Stuart has been a member of the TSN since 2002, and he's currently a member of the Accounts, Legal, and ITDS committees. He also participates as an inaugural member of the Trade Ambassador Program. Current is also a member of the NCBFAA subcommittee on automation and recently joined the RAC committee for oversight of all the other 47 agencies outside of U.S. Customs. So with that, I'd like to welcome Stuart and invite you to give your presentation. Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you very much, Michael. That's very kind of you, and my apologies to all for just disrupting the order. I was supposed to go first. So one of the slides that I have on here is a little bit of background information, and that would be we'll go through that. I think that Domenic probably covered that very well. So what I'd like to do, and what Michael really asked me to do, was what does this mean to us as brokers? What changes in our life and our entries, and how can we help our customers through this? As Domenic had mentioned, and Kristen as well, is that a lot of times our customers depend on us to drive this forward, through them. So they're looking to us not only for direction, but then also they're also looking to us to answer all of their questions. So what I'd like to do is just go through and talk about what's not changing, what does change, and then the myriad of exemptions and how they may impact us from an entry standpoint, and then talk a little bit more about what brokers need to submit to FDA. So if we move on to the next slide, please. And then you can skip this slide. So what doesn't change? And there's a lot of things that don't change, right? So from an entry standpoint, we still need prior notice for importations of food. That doesn't change. FDA hasn't redefined what is a food or a food product per se. So again, that doesn't change. The registration process for foreign suppliers and food manufacturers and anyone who was required to register before that manufacture, process, pack, or hold food must still register, and that hasn't changed. There is no fee to register or update your registration at any particular time. And even the registration process itself, it still renews every 2 years, so that hasn't changed. The facilities that are exempt from registration haven't changed, and who can register a facility, even all that, none of the registration process has changed, nor has FDA's refusal process changed. If you're not registered, FDA is still going to refuse it, even though you have this FSV importer party. So let's talk about what's not covered and what are these exemptions. So there's, to my way of thinking, there's 3 types of exemptions. Some are statutory, regulatory, and then there's 2 that are temporary. And that's based on the size of the foreign supplier or the size of the business itself as a very small business. So, so first of all, the list here are the things that are exempt by regulation. So if your article is already subject to HACCP, the food does not need to be covered by a foreign supplier verification program. If the food's being imported for research or evaluation, for personal consumption, alcoholic beverages, certain ingredients for alcoholic beverages, food that's imported for processing and then future export is not covered, nor are low-acid canned foods such as canned vegetables, and certain meat, poultry, and egg products regulated by the U.S. Department of Agriculture would not be subject at the time of importation. So, so some of the things that are changing, and I think Domenic covered this as well, is it's a flexible risk-based approach to the foreign supplier verification. And the way that I state it when I talk internally is really, you know, FDA is providing food importers and food suppliers a flexible approach to meet the requirements of having their food being manufactured to the same standards as if it was manufactured in the U.S. So you know, the flexibility creates both a you know, it's both good, and flexibility for us as brokers, I think sometimes presents a challenge, at least until the program becomes fully implemented. So when do I need to begin reporting? And Domenic probably covered this, and the reason I wanted to start off with this is because I don't want to read through each and every one of these slides. This came directly from FDA.gov, and I think FDA has done a very good job of identifying who's subject and when they are subject. But the whole intent of these slides was to show the brokers and the importers on the that are attending of the complexity of how this decision tree process is going to be made. So as a broker, you need to understand that there are various implementation dates ranging from May 30th. So in this particular slide, on the compliance date for food whose supplier is not subject to the PC or produce safety rules, or is not importing animal food, is for the most part it's going to be effective on May 30th, 2017. But if you're a small business, it might not be till March 19th of 2018, a whole year later, along with very small businesses and qualified facilities, it's going to be 2 years, March 18th of 2019. Or if you're subject to the pasteurized milk ordinance, that's going to be March 18th, 2019. So a lot of complexity on who's covered and when they're covered. And so we need to be familiar with this so that when we're talking to our customers that we can help them through this process. Next slide, please. So again, you know, this slide has some more dates going out to 2020 for certain aspects here. And then on the next slide, you're going to see even more dates of entities on when they're covered. So very, very complex. All right. So again, you know, to go through all this, you'd have to be, you know, you need to be you have to have a master's in understanding FDA tree logic there to determine who is eligible when, and I'm sure there'll be some more clarification that comes out from that, but you know, for right now we're focusing on those entities that are covered and are effective on May 30th. So so what do I need to do? What do I need to transmit as a broker? So now we've kind of covered what's in there as a product, and what's in there, you know, from a small business standpoint or from a very small business standpoint. So what do I need to do? So my tariff number, I know, is going to be flagged with this information, and FDA is expecting this information. So what do I need to do in order to either report the data or exempt the data based on these particular dates? So in order to accomplish this, FDA has created what is known as an FSV party in the FDA record set, as part of the PGA message set, of course. So currently for food items, we transmit 4 parties. The FSV party will become a 5th party, just like it is for certain medical devices. We have 5 parties. For drugs, you may have 5 or 6 parties. So really this FSV identifier is just a new party that gets reported at the line level. And because it's at the line level, it also accommodates a lot of this flexibility for these parties. Importers may have different certifying parties for different food products that may be on the same entry. So you will be able to accommodate that because it is at the line level. Or they may have certain commodities where they have, it may be the same commodity, and that might be coming from different countries. They might want to have different FSV parties. That can also be accommodated. So again, the flexibility, I think, is important here. It's also very important to know that CBP will not accept this identifier until transmissions that occur on May 30th. So if you pre-file your entries and you're transmitting to customs and it's within the 5-day variable window where the information goes to FDA, then you're fine you cannot transmit it prior to May 30th. So if you're in the, if you transmit or update the transmission for cargo release after a reject or what have you on May 30th or after, then you're going to have to add that FSV party. So a little bit of pain, pinch point pain going through the transition. So the first couple days you may look at it and get some rejects. You want to make sure that you understand that it's probably because you don't have the party in there and properly identified. So we also then have, if the FDA has identified the programs which would apply, so if it's a NSF or a PRO or an additive or DSU or feed, then the details will be mandatory. Unless the industry code is 16 or 32, so again, more exceptions in there. I would think most software vendors have determined that if it's in industry code 16 or 32, that they will automatically not prompt you for this particular party. But do be aware that your software vendor may not have had time to put that edit in there, and you may want to, you're going to have your users know in that case not to add the party. So what we do transmit is if you are transmitting a FSV party and it's not an exemption line, you are transmitting the DUNS number. I've heard some confusion where FDA, and particularly if you look on the FDA website, it says that there are, the way that they word it is a FDA approved identifier number. Well, to my knowledge, the FDA has only approved the DUNS number, so that is the only number that is acceptable. An FEI number has not been approved, nor has an IRS number or any other entity identifiers. So the DUNS number, the firm name, the firm address, and I would highly recommend that you transmit those as to how they are registered, just like any other FDA addresses that we transmit. So those are required in PG-19. In the PG-20 record, you would have the name and address. And then in the 21 record, typically we would transmit a phone number, an email address, and a contact party name. For this particular party, FDA is only asking for an email address, and the phone number and the contact party name are optional. But again, I would recommend that you would participate with that. So that's what, those are the data elements that we transmit if you're reporting this party. Now, so what happens to all these exceptions that you already told me about? These food items aren't subject. This entity isn't subject. I've got a product that isn't subject. So how do I transmit that? So again, CBP is expecting, I'm sorry, just go back to that last slide, please. And I'm at the bottom of the slide here. So if it's a food item and it's not transmitted, the entry will be rejected. We know that. So the way that we're going to bypass that or work around whatever term that you use is you will need to send an affirmation of compliance code for FSX if it is an exempt product or entity. So that the affirmation of compliance code will then notify CBP that not to expect this FSV party name, address, and email address in the entry. If the food is being imported for research and evaluation, then you would send an exemption code of RNE, and again, the same thing will happen. So whether it is exempt by policy, whether it's exempt by regulation, whether it's exempt for any means, you will transmit one of these two exemption codes in the AOC field. And then, so what do we need to do to prepare? How do I talk to my employees about this? And it pretty much follows the same path that you're going to prepare your customers. You need to know the rules. They are extremely complex, full of exemptions and exceptions. You want to review the FSVP rule with your customer to determine if and when it is applicable. Talk about the exemptions and when they apply, so you know if you're expecting to report a program code or if you are just exempting that commodity. The exemptions I heard Domenic talk about for Canada and New Zealand, you need to know what to report in those circumstances. And then you also want to coordinate with your importer, determine who is the FSVP in their supply chain, make sure that there may be multiples, and have your databases altered so that you can may be able to capture multiples for that particular customer. Be in a position to provide those new data elements, and for the importers, they want to make sure that their suppliers and manufacturers are registered with both FDA and Dun & Bradstreet. I've got a list of resources here that you can go through. I think probably the most valuable one of these is the very first one, and that's why it's at the top. Am I subject to FVSP? This takes you out to the FDA. I'm not sure if Domenic reviewed this or not, but this is just a wonderful, once you click on that link, it takes you and you just answer some questions, and as long as you answer the question, it tells you where you're covered, what you need to submit, and when you're covered. So I can't emphasize that particular one enough. And then, of course, the other assortment of links that are there for you. And then the last one is the FDA provided Dun & Bradstreet lookup. In case you're not aware of it, FDA provides this to the entire community for where you can go and register and then look up Dun & Bradstreet numbers for various entities by street address. And then the last thing that I see a note here that I skipped is the Dun & Bradstreet number. The DUNS number that gets reported in the entry is the DUNS number, and FDA recommends that you use the DUNS number of the facility where those FSVP records are stored. So that may be a different DUNS number than the FD1 party. That's the importer record. If they store those records in another location, then FDA is recommending that you would use that particular DUNS number. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Michael.
Thank you, Stuart. Particularly that last point. I know I've had a lot of questions from folks about what party would be appropriate for the FSV importer in the U.S., and that was a clarification that we received from FDA. It's where the records are to be stored. So with that, we have quite a list of questions here.
And
so
hey,
we'll
Megan, before you get into that, I just want to let everybody know there's been a couple of questions. I'll repeat my statement from the beginning. We are absolutely going to be sending out a PDF copy of the presentation after the webinar, and it'll come with a brief survey. So please, everybody on the line, know that you are going to be getting a copy of these excellent presentations. Thanks, Mike.
No problem, Megan. So we have a half an hour for questions, and we already have quite a few questions, but please feel free to submit them, and we'll get to as many as we possibly can. And I'll leave these open to all the presenters who care to comment on them. The first one is kind of a two-pronged question, so I'll go ahead and read it and then maybe give my interpretation, and if somebody could jump in and answer that, or maybe it's a two-part answer for two different people. So in the case of raw agricultural commodities from Canada, consolidators often sample every inbound shipment into their facility and then ship out a large stockpile to the U.S. FSVP definitely does not allow the consolidator to act as a foreign supplier. The supplier is the farmer in these cases. FDA's Federal Register states that qualified individuals may prepare the foreign supplier performance and hazard analysis to reduce the impact of the requirements. In these cases where homogeneous policies, procedures, practices, and hazards carry from supplier to supplier, may the consolidator prepare the FSVP information as a qualified individual without the consent of the supplier? So I think we have two questions here. First of all, in cases where there's a consolidator involved, specifically with grains and agricultural commodities that may be brought into a facility and mixed, who is responsible to the U.S. party to supply records for the FSV importer? And secondly, I think the question is also asking, could the foreign party act as the qualified individual to certify that the goods are in compliance for the purposes of FSVP? So would anybody care to tackle that one? Domenic, I think this is right up your alley.
Yeah, Michael, if I understand it correctly, Michael, and I'm struggling a little bit with the process. Obviously, the FSVP importer has to be located in the United States, and the consolidator can't be over in Canada in terms of being identified and doing and maintaining the documentation. It has to be in the United States to do that. The qualified individual, however, can be located anywhere. So if they are going to utilize qualified individual and consolidator, I think that's acceptable, and they can prepare all the documents and provide it to the FSVP importer that's located in the United States. Under this scenario, I think whoever asked the question is correct, that the supplier is actually not the consolidator, but the actual farm, so forth, and the FSVP importers have to approve that facility, not the consolidator. So that's what I heard, Mike. I hope I answered it. The question. If you don't think I did, let me know.
No, I think you did, Domenic, because I've had this posed to me a number of times, and the answer I've always given is it traces back to the farms. But the consolidator, as accepting the raw agricultural commodity in from the farmers, could act as a conduit for the information to help the FSV importer certify that the facilities are in compliance. That's the answer that I've been giving.
Absolutely. One of the things that they have to do is do a verification activity. And that verification activity could be the testing that's done by the consolidator for every shipment.
So the next question was, do we need to supply the FSVP importers FDA registration number? And I think, from the presentations today, I'll just take this one on. It's quite clear that the information that FDA is looking for is the name, address, email address, and DUNS number, if available, of the FSVP importer. So there is no need in the FSVP importer information to supply the registration number. However, there are other data fields within the FDA information that may be required.
Mike, can I also add that there is no requirement that the FSVP importer has to register with the FDA. If they're a manufacturer, processor, so that falls under Section 415 of the Act, that's a different story. But under the regulation, the determination was made very early on that an FSVP importer does not have to register with the FDA.
That kind of backs into another question I had, Domenic, and I'll pitch this one out for anybody's comment. I noticed that in the FSVP that the Food and Drug Administration specifically points out that there may be instances where the goods are imported by a party who will not further manufacture them, and there could be some assurances to that party from a secondary party that they will bring the product into conformance, and that could have a reflection upon how the FSVP importer certifies the status of the goods?
Mike, are you getting at the written assurance provision? Is that what you're talking about?
That's exactly what I'm talking about.
Dominic, do you want to take this one, or do you want me to take this one?
Sure. No, I can start and you can jump on it if you want. I mean, overall, what has to happen is if a product is going to be going for further processing where the hazards are controlled later on, it has to be clear. There has to be a declaration that says that the products being imported are not, the hazards associated with this product has not been controlled. And then they need to have a written assurance from their customer saying that they are going to control that hazard, and that has to be done on an annual basis.
Yeah, but Dominic, just to clarify, you know, there's a guidance, or that was draft guidance that was just issued a little while ago. The comment period closed with regard to the requirements for the disclosure and how that disclosure needs to be written. But right now, there's that 2-year stay on the written assurance, or the letter, not letters back, but the written documentation back that hazard has been controlled. So right now, we're just subject to disclosure.
Yeah, and that guidance document is called Describing a Hazard That Needs Control in Documents Accompanying the Food as Required by 4 Rules Implementing the FDA Food Safety Modernization Act.
Super, guys. Thank you. The next question is, again, it's one that I've had posed to me a number of times. For the small importer exemption, the $1 million, is that U.S. only, or is that worldwide? A lot of companies are multinationals. They have offices in a number of countries. So is that a cumulative total for the company as a whole, or would that only be for the United States?
It's U.S., and I have so many regulations in my mind, but it is for human food, it's $1 million U.S. annual sales over an average 3-year period. For animal food, it's $2.5 million U.S. Sales. And Dominic, please chime in if I need to.
Well, I'm looking at the definition of a very small importer. The last part says, regardless of whether you import human food, animal food, or both, you must consider all your food sales, not just sales of the food you import, and not just sales to the United States. So it might be, in my opinion, reading that, it looks like it's going to be all of it.
I have another question that's kind of a small question, but it opens a really big door. So what exactly are the broker's obligations for FSVP compliance, and what will FDA look to the broker to provide to have on file to be in compliance with FSVP?
So that's a great question, Mike. In terms of it, in my opinion, I don't think there's anything within FSMA that relies that kind of directly goes to the broker's responsibilities, other than the inputting of data. So it's not in the law that specifically calls out the brokers. I think it's kind of an offshoot of the work that they perform. It's the responsibility of the FSVP importer to make sure that they identify the FSVP importer, and that means a relationship between them, the manufacturer, the importer of record, and the broker. So the broker falls into it just because of the fact that they're the ones putting in the data, and under other provisions, such like the FDA audit program, they could be held accountable for wrong data that's put in. And that's why I think it's extremely important that you make it clear when you work with your clients to make sure that you identify that right individual who's going to be the FSVP importer, because there will be a trail, and the agency will follow up during an audit to say, why did you provide the wrong one? So that's why, during my presentation, I think it's extremely important to take a look at the contracts and the agreements that you have with your clients and specify and declare that it's up to them to go through the process of the supply chain and identify the right FSVP importer at the time of entry.
Thank you, Domenic.
Yeah. So Mike, and I just piggyback on that, and I always follow the logic, and to me the logic is the FDA filer evaluation. So, and Domenic, I think, hit it right on the head, is the fact that we know that if FDA comes in and even if we transmitted data that was incorrect, however, we have some sort of confirmation from an importer, whether that's through an EDI feed or just an email, something that says this is the party that I want you to report for that. Since we have no way of verifying that, we are basically transmitters of data. So we just want to make sure that we are transmitting the data as provided to us, and that kind of goes back to having, what do I need to do to prepare, and that is talk to our importers, make sure that we have contact with them, and they have identified the correct party for that particular FSV program.
Yeah, and we had another question further on asking, as a broker, what's our job to verify this? And I don't think that FDA expects the broker to police the FSVP importer. If we're receiving information stating that this is the FSVP importer for entry purposes, we need to be able to have some assurances so that we can be comfortable in accepting that, but it's not up to us to go out and police and make sure that they have everything in place to comply. Now, I know Domenic, I had a discussion earlier this week with some folks, and we were talking about, from the FSV importer's perspective, what is FDA expecting? What happens if somebody is obligated and it comes to find out later on that they did not agree to be the FSV importer? Do you have any insight on that?
I think what's going to end up happening is that FSVP importer, whoever was identified during that shipment, will end up being placed on import alert. I mean, that's the only thing I can think of, or that product and that supplier. I'm sure there'll be follow-up in terms of how it happened, but there has to be a signed agreement if someone is going to agree to it. But I think overall, Mike, I think the process itself is going to identify who that FSVP importer is. And if someone is designated or is identified otherwise, then it goes back to the importer of record, most likely, as to providing the wrong information. And a review of contracts will have to be looked at. Because you have to remember that, if you look at the regulations itself, what's going to happen is there are oftentimes when there are multiple owners. So there may be an owner of it, or a shipment may be sold to multiple people. And then the goal is that these people would work together to determine who's going to be responsible for FSVP. So in the past, I have always said, when I was with the agency, that I think there always had to be a relationship throughout the supply chain. This actually kind of makes it has to happen, or there is going to be a problem. And it would have to be through a traceback or through investigations to determine what the outcome is going to be and who's going to be responsible for the fact that somebody was asked to do it without any knowledge.
Yeah, and I just want to follow up on that point that multiple parties can meet the FSVP importer, but at the end of the day, one person is only entered into the field for ACE. So that's kind of a concept with a lot of misconceptions right now floating around. So multiple people can meet the definition, meaning they either own the food or have agreed to purchase the food at the time that it crosses the border. So there can be multiple people meeting that definition. If no one meets that definition, then...
So Domenic, this is Stuart here, and just kind of the follow up with that. So, so let's say that you have a FSV importer who has certified certain products that perhaps they produce and distribute directly to on a direct basis to a customer here in the U.S. And they authorize them to use their DUNS number as the FSV party in that circumstance. And yet, so now there's this, opens up this potential for, I'll call it identity theft of FSV party information. So if that same importer was to import food from another party and, you know, use that other party's information, DUN number and email address and name and address inadvertently, you know, is there liability built in here, and what's the protection for the person whose information was reported incorrectly?
Again, I think with the first step is going to be kind of a traceback aspect. We would go to the broker. Let's take it back. First of all, we would go to where the agency would end up going to the FSVP importer, who would state, I'm not responsible for that food. I don't get it. I didn't make any arrangements to it. I shouldn't have been used as that. Then they're going to go to the broker and they'll say, you know, if I had to play this out, I'd go to the broker and say, you know, where'd you get your information from? They would say the importer of record. I'd go to the importer of record. I'd find out who provided that information, and I would trace it back to determine who was responsible for authorizing the use of that number. And they could be held accountable one way or the other.
Can I mention something on that? GMA does have one very large member that is very concerned about that exact occurrence, and there's some prediction that will happen on some levels. But Domenic, from my understanding, that, you know, that person, that FSVP importer, or that could be placed on import alert, or that could affect the filer's review.
Here's the issue is if they use an individual, the FSVP importer was not authorized, didn't give permission to be the FSVP importer. It's hard for the agency to put that individual on an import alert because they didn't do anything wrong. Somebody falsely used their name or used their information to get a product into the country. I think that company has a right to fight that decision if the agency did go that way. I don't think it would be the right thing to do for the agency to do it. What I think would happen is it would have to do an investigation of who provided the false information. So I think it's difficult to try to do that. The agency only has so many resources, and I think that might happen. But I think the agency will work through that, similar to what they did with the U.S. agent, where people were being identified and not knowing that they were identified. They'd probably come up with a way. Don't forget, you have to provide an email address associated with it. So it's very possible that the agency can implement a process where they issue an email to say, you have been recognized as the FSVP importer. Is this true? So they could do that. If that becomes an issue, I think the agency can work out things to rectify that issue.
Yeah, and from my understanding, and I'll let Mike and Domenic chime in, and Stuart chime in on this, is that if you're put down as the FSVP importer, you get no type of confirmation of that. That's been my answer.
Yeah, I think that's probably correct, because I don't think so. But one thing that they are going to be doing, though, is they are going to be posting that list. So yes, they keep track of the people that are, but the law actually states that the agency is supposed to post a list of all FSVP importers. All we came from is we don't know who's going to be the FSVP importer because they didn't require a registration for FSVP importers. That's why they're going to build that database and then post it on a yearly basis if they can, as to who's in compliance. The easiest thing to do is people that aren't in compliance. So prior to me leaving, we were talking about, how should we publicize this list? Is there another way? Do we have to do it by the letter of the law? Or can we do it vice versa and only post those that are in violation of 805 rather than people that are in compliance with 805?
Okay, we've got another question. Actually, we've got several different iterations of this question that kind of tag on to this. And I'll read the shortest, most compact version of it, and that is, if the importer of record is a Canadian company, and this would work for other countries as well, who are shipping to multiple U.S. importers, who would be the FSV importer? Now, I know that's not, that could be an easy answer, or it could be a very complicated answer.
Shipping to multiple, I'm sorry, just multiple importers and the, okay.
Multiple importers, and the question I would have asked the asker if I had him in the room with me is, who is the buyer?
Right.
Because if you have a shipment with multiple buyers, it's entirely different than if you have a shipment with one buyer.
Right.
So let me, I'm sorry, Kristen, go ahead.
No, Dominic, go ahead, please. Then I'll chime in.
So I believe there is, I believe the guidance document hasn't come out yet. I think that'll be answered within the guidance document. If I remember correctly, one of the things is if a supplier is sending to multiple buyers, there can be an agreement between everyone that one person is going to be responsible to be the FSVP importer. But there has to be an agreement of that.
Sí, sí, pues el producto va a dos diferentes consignatarios. ¿Quién va a ser el FSV importer? Y dice el vato, aún no sabemos quién va a ser uno de los dos. Pero es tonto, güey, porque por ejemplo, en el sistema, tú puedes poner, puedes meter múltiple. Y cuando ponen la factura, pones el manufacturador y pones el último consignatario. A lo que yo entiendo, el FSVP importer, güey, va a ser quien compra la mercancía. Pero si lo compran dos y van en un solo camión, pues después...
Mike, did you get that?
Puede poner dos. Okay. Pero el sistema sí. Pues ahora estuvo más claro que la otra vez. Bueno, que ya van como dos, creo.
If we have members that don't have their phone on mute, if you could, please. Okay, so moving on. How are food contact substances handled under the FSVP? I know there's been quite a bit of discussion about that this week in particular.
Mike, I just want to clear. So one of the things related to contact surfaces, and Stuart mentioned earlier that the definition of food didn't change. I just want to make sure that Stuart was talking about the definition of food under the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act, which includes food contact substances. However, the prior notice definition of food doesn't include food contact substances. So I just wanted to be clear that we're all on the same page with the understanding that the definition that they're using under FSVP is the definition under the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act related to that. But for contact surfaces, food contact substances, it is considered a food under the definition of I think it's 201F3 of the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act. And it is required under FSVP, but the agency yet doesn't know how to handle it. So they actually put out a Federal Register announcement back in 2016. It's Federal Register 57784, I believe it is. And it said that they don't understand how to handle it yet, so they pushed it back, the requirement for food contact substances, to May of 2019. So they extended that date for food contact substances to comply with the FSVP portion of it.
Exactly.
Okay. Are there any issues with having customers who are not subject to the May 30th deadline file FSVP information ahead of their phase schedule?
So their compliance date yet is not due. Maybe it's due in 2018, but they're going to go ahead and list an FSVP importer and claim that they're subject to FSVP using the affirmation of compliance code, FSV. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Yep.
So then I don't know why they would do that, and you know, welcome Domenic and Stuart to chime in, but I don't know why they would do that, because then, you know, FDA is developing a list of FSVP importers based on the information entered into the system. So they might come knock on your door to assess compliance, yet compliance is not due. So are you really sure you're ready for compliance? If you have another year to comply, I would kind of take, I mean, this is, I'm not a lawyer, and but, you know, if you're not due to comply, why are you telling the agency you're ready to comply? That's my own professional opinion, but I welcome that to the other panelists.
From a brokerage standpoint, the information that we transmit doesn't differentiate between one or the other. So technically, we could report information for a party who is not yet mandatorily subject to the reporting requirements. But again, like you said, I don't know why somebody would want to do that.
Yeah, there's no benefit. I mean, Kristen is absolutely right. The agency is going to end up going in, they're going to put you on a list, and they're going to identify, you know, I think they're trying to figure out how many numbers they're going to finish in FY17. The training that they're getting is going to begin in June for the regulatory aspects. So shortly after that, they're going to start inspections. Why would you want to have FDA come in there and do an inspection? Because they are going to educate as best they can early on, unless there's a public health outcome. If there's an issue that is, they're not going to educate if you're subject to it. But they're going to come in there and do an inspection, and then they're going to document the violations associated with your FSVP program. So now you're on notice to correct those, even though you're not, you know, subject to it. So I agree with Kristen 100%. You don't want FDA in your facility if you don't need them to be. Have a year of reprieve. Find out what's going on and what the violations and what the problems are that they're seeing over the course of the year, and that way you can adapt to your FSVP program and make the appropriate changes before you have to come into compliance.
Thank you, Domenic. Megan, I think we're pretty much out of time, and we have a lot of questions. So would it be appropriate to say that we'll gather these together and in some of the repeats do an aggregate and try and get a response of all the questions out to the membership?
Absolutely. Well, at the very least, out to the folks on this call. And before we wrap up, I know Kristen's got a bit of news to share.
Yeah, and just wanted to make certain that it was clear that the food safety systems recognized as comparable are New Zealand, Australia, and Canada. Just wanted to make certain that there was clarity around that. And then we didn't touch on this, and I wonder if it's in the questions, but if you do if food is imported for research and development purposes, the law is very clear about how it needs to be labeled and how it, what qualifies for research and development, and it's very, very limited. So if the code RNE is used for research and evaluation, the food has to be labeled a certain way, it's in a limited quantity, there's a number of stipulations, and your customer, the FSVP importer, should really understand that before saying that it's for research and development and evaluation only.
Okay, well, thank you very much. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you all for joining, and especially thank you to Mike, Stuart, Kristen, and Domenic for putting together the presentations. We will aggregate all the questions. We'll send them around to the panelists and try and get everybody to weigh in, especially on the questions that we didn't get a chance to get to on the webinar today. And in addition, we'll get those out to the folks on the line. In addition to that, we'll be sending out a PDF copy of today's presentations and a short survey that we'd like you to complete. Thank you again for your participation, and for everyone on the phone who has a mother, I hope that you and your family have a lovely Mother's Day. Enjoy the rest of your day.
You too, Megan.
Thank you.
Thanks.